When people with disabilities protest their lives, particularly with aggressive behavior, the professional response is to put them on behavior programs. It rarely occurs to those of us who do or have done this that we are in fact working in a larger social pattern of keeping dissident voices silent, of keeping the powerless powerless.
Is it reasonable in your mind to assume that if somebody's behavior is not meeting our standards and we think dangerous in a very restrictive setting, that they're not ready to go into a less restrictive setting?
Oh, that is one of the worst snares in the business. It's in fact the people who what they're saying is they're not ready to live in an institution, and what they need is to get out and get into a much more typical place. One of the powerful contributors of behavior modification is that the environment is a strong teacher. So why would you expect somebody living 50 miles from nowhere to understand social behavior when they have no models for it?
Have you had direct experience with individuals whose behavior was a very serious problem when they were living in an institutional setting, and where that behavior became a much less serious problem when they moved into a more normalized kind of setting?
Sure. Many times.
Could you talk about a couple of those?
Gentleman who was breaking glass all the time, doing it with his head, and he was getting to the point where he was near death, or he was near to dying because there was nothing left to stitch.
Where was he living at the time?
When I met him, he was living in a little tract house in the suburb, and he had been a ward of the state, grown up in an institution also. And he got there, and they did the same things in this house that they were doing in the institution. The behavior was identical. And it was... The interesting turning point for him was two things. One was, I didn't know him, so I wasn't going to talk to him about this, but I asked, who feels closest to him, most comfortable. Talk to him, ask him, why do you break why do you go through windows? And very sociable young man. And the woman asked him, and he said, I don't know. He said, nobody ever asked, which was bad. And the next thing we asked him was, they asked him, was, given that breaking glass seems to be important to you, is there some way you can do it safely? Because we don't really care about the glass if it comes to that. It's you, which is something they never said to him. And he came up with an idea of taking jelly jars and wrapping them up in newspaper, putting them in a paper bag and stomping on them. And so he had broken glass with it safely. I would never have invented that. It was by asking him. And he taught us how he could live more calmly.
Did the behavior of breaking glass with his head stop?
And I don't know where he learned that, but somewhere in his head that meant it was a satisfying experience. So it's, instead of wrestling with him about, we'll keep you away from doing it, it's provide people what they want, but do it in a way that doesn't make them look foolish or doesn't get them hurt. That doesn't seem like such a very complicated concept to me, but for some reason it's been hard for people see that somehow as giving in or making concessions or admitting defeat, when I'm seeing it as a way of learning how to cooperate with people that we haven't taken the time to understand very well.
Realistically, aren't there many people who don't have disabilities, who are doing jobs they hate, who are living in situations they don't like because of financial realities and because of lack of skills?
That's an extension of the argument that people sometimes give me too, and is, well, if we do this for this one person, then we have to do it for everyone, and we can't, so let's not do it for anyone. And I'm not sure that the culture profits from having any group of people oppressed on the strength of a label. And yes, there are, of course, there are people who are leading lives of noisy desperation everywhere, but they're not looking to human services to support their lives. And although if they did, it might refresh their perspective. But, I mean, the larger social problem is how to empower people to feel more confident. But I'm talking about people who are looking and say to me, I certainly am not going to endorse putting someone in a situation that's unpleasant for them when I know otherwise and could do otherwise.
Let me run a scenario by you that I was involved with. There was a young man who'd come out of a state hospital and who was attending, he was in the last couple of years of his high school program. And he had learned to smoke, needed to smoke, and was very unhappy if he couldn't smoke. And it was it was one of the most important things in his life was that he had access to cigarettes and that he could in fact smoke. And the school said, well, we have rules. Nobody here is allowed to smoke. If we're going to treat this young man normally, number one, we can't allow him to smoke. Number two, if we allow him to smoke, we're going to have to let everybody else smoke. And number three, we're going to really be stigmatizing him if we allow him to do things that nobody else can do. So what happened was an ongoing battle went on about the cigarettes. He was not allowed to smoke. He kept running away to try to have a cigarette. Eventually the young man returned to the state institution because his behavior got worse and worse.
So in Minnesota you can be incarcerated for smoking?
If you do it in the wrong building, actually, you can. But no, I think the view of the people was, these are reasonable expectations. If this young man is going to grow up at all normally, he's going to have to learn to follow the rules. These are the rules in this school. We're not going to change them for him. So, he wasn't reinstitutionalized because he smoked. He was reinstitutionalized because his behavior got worse and worse as their behavior got worse and worse.
Yes.
How do you react to that, Herb?
Well, a couple of things. First off, the teachers never went into the student lavatory, ever. The boys' room, he was the only student in the school that ever smoked.
He was the only student with a disability that ever smoked.
So he was probably much more likely to get caught than other kids. The other kids were smoking, they just weren't being found.
He had several objectives on his IEP that addressed the whole issue of him smoking, or not smoking in school. It's data we're taking regularly.
Yes, well, when in doubt, take data. Well, I'll tell you, first off, that's a rule. If the school wants to establish that and get away with it, it's not such a bizarre thing that anyone would lose sleep. The problem is that all the other kids coming to that school have come out of more or less typical families, whatever they are, and had a lot of experience as to what social expectations are. And not only do they understand social expectations, they understand the payoffs for adhering to them. This guy's coming out of an institution where basically life revolves around cigarettes and coffee. And that holds true for the people who work there, as well as for the people who live there, in my experience. So that I can't think of an analogy. What you're doing is you've given this man the one quality to life that makes it satisfying for him, or endurable even, and saying we can't do that here because it would be stigmatizing. What the guy would need is a lot of experience on understanding that there are things out there in the world that are worth having, other things than cigarettes. And so that if you know why you go 6 hours of a school day without a cigarette, because you're going to get all these other riches, other benefits, that would have been much easier for him to understand. Whereas these other kids had not been locked away for years on end, had not been taught to smoke, or probably had access to a lot of other recreations that smoking had been the one sum total of for him. Does that make sense?
But on a concrete level, what does that all mean about the school's behavior? Does that mean they allow him to smoke or to drink coffee during class, or to act in other ways which are not considered generally acceptable while you're working on that? Or
this was some kind of finishing school where people were learning party manners?
It's high school.
Okay. Not what I learned in high school, certainly. If their real goal was to teach kids, and this guy has a very special history. He's a different history from the other kids. If he had come in speaking Cambodian, would they have insisted that he only speak English perfectly or not at all?
Unfortunately, that many times is true.
Wow. Okay, my interest for someone who came in speaking another language would be to recognize they probably don't have a lot of English. Teach it to them. And it would have been much more interesting to teach this guy why we don't smoke here, why that's an issue here. But meanwhile, since it is for you, let's find some way to accommodate this. The teachers didn't smoke in the building either?
They were teachers.
Yeah. And, it's recognizing individual histories and needs that makes a lot of sense to me, as opposed to just saying, well, if we're going to make everyone normal, then everyone has to conform as of January 1st. Life doesn't work that way.
Let me give you another example, which again is a real example. A young woman who had her expressive language was very difficult to understand, and she was just really developing her expressive language. She was 14 years old at the time. And the teachers became very concerned because when they would try to engage her in conversation, many times she wouldn't, as they put it, talk about what they wanted to talk about. And so they would keep working with her to try to get her what they want to talk about, what they wanted to talk about. And then oftentimes her behavior would get very bad, and then she'd have to be put into timeout because she was beginning to bang things and throw things because she wouldn't talk about what they wanted to talk about. How does that situation at all exemplify some of your concerns about the ways in which traditionally we have dealt with the needs of people with severe or profound disabilities?
Yeah, that's just, oh my word. I taught high school. I found it not uncommon for students not to want to talk about what I wanted to talk about. And I somehow got around that without recourse to a timeout room. It's why do people lose perspective on what they're trying to achieve to the point of abusing people? It's if this girl who's got a different learning style, has a different history, and is at that point in her life learning something, why not celebrate that? Why not go with that? And the fact that she was talking at all would be very exciting, and support her in just having the experience of having speech come from inside her out, as opposed to being told that it's something we parrot back and that we put into you. And that loss, and then to punish her for not wanting to collaborate with that agenda is very, very, that's disturbing.